thank you. So we're going from favelas to smart cities. So hold on to your hats. So I'm a PI of an ESRC funded project on Milton Keynes, a smart city actually. But this paper is generated by some just kind of general. It's a kind of byproduct of the project, which as I was reading around smart cities, going to smart city events and so on, started to strike me that imagination has quite a complicated role in relation to discourses of the smart city. So I've put together this talk around that problematic. I guess I probably don't need to say this to this audience, but just in case, smart cities, smart technologies. Smart cities have saturated with smart technologies that generate and analyse big urban data, and they're one of the major ways in which urban transformations are being planned right now. But there's also huge amounts of imagination, imaginary work going on around that tech to make sense of it. It's being made meaningful, it's narrated, it's visualised in really particular kinds of ways. The large software companies who sell smart city technologies are putting huge amounts of work, actually surprising amounts, if they're so evidently good. Quite why they need to advertise them so heavily is an interesting question, but they are putting lots of work into explaining, selling, creating their own smart imaginaries on their YouTube channels, in television adverts, through their Twitter feeds, and at expos. Indeed, Siemens has built a whole exhibition space in London Docklands on sustainable urbanism, which for them is smart. And of course, for many city leaders, their rankings in smart city league tables are really important, and it matters to them that when we think of Amsterdam or Barcelona or Songdo, that we think of them also as smart cities. Now, some of the work I've been doing is thinking a bit more carefully about how these smart cities are imagined, what the kind of contents of these visualizations and so on might signify. I'm happy to say a little bit more about that, perhaps in discussion. But what I'm more interested in just thinking a bit more about, given the topic of this roundtable, is the role of imagination itself. Imagination as a process, a thing, a concept, a place we will find, and how that is being positioned in relation to smart, which I think is important given that, yes, so smart is being pitched as one of the main ways in which cities are going to be transforming into the future. And I think it strikes me that in relation to smart cities and the imagination, smart seems to be to suffer either from too much imagination or has a kind of deficit of imagination. So let me explain what I mean by that. And I'm going to start off by thinking about humans before moving on to the city itself. So humans, it seems, in smart cities, are either not being imaginative enough or they're being far too imaginative. So, for example, and I won't go through all the references here, but a lot of this is drawn from literatures, especially critical social science literatures about smart cities. People in smart cities, they or we or lots of us anyway, are unaware that our data is being more and more untethered from its provenance, reducing our ability to interrogate it, for example. Apparently we choose to consent to terms and conditions without ever thinking about their consequences. I wrote this a little while ago. I think perhaps events in recent weeks may need a little more modification of this kind of account. But you'll hear critical essays talking about how we choose to thoughtlessly hand our decision-making over to corporations and their machines. Adam Greenfield argues this at length. Mark Graham suggests we've been enacting a general lack of awareness. So it seems that few of us are peering beyond our smartphone screens to imagine the chains of code and data in which smart tech is embedded. So in short, we, the users of the smart city, if you like, the residents, aren't imagining it properly. We're not being imaginative enough about it. On the other hand, many of those same critics would argue that the marketeers of smart city and its hype, they're accused of having way too much imagination. All those beautiful computer-generated images of computer-generated cities in which data flows endlessly and smoothly through the air. Inhabitants have nothing better to do than linger around in the sunshine, looking at screens in their perfectly efficient and coordinated lives. The cities always look clean and new, and the only problems that are ever made visible are the ones that data indeed can itself solve. So all this is ridiculous, the critics say, and of course they're right. And it's nothing like what smart cities might actually do or be like. But again, the criticism is that smart cities are not being imagined properly. There isn't a proper relation to the imagination. Smart is deemed to be too imaginary, too spectacular, too ridiculous. The ambitions it articulates are so extreme that they become little more than a fantasy, to quote Ori Halpern, utterly untethered from any reality. So where does this kind of problematic thing going on with imagination and smart come from? Well, I did something that I always tell students not to do, which is that I went to the Oxford English Dictionary to look up the definition of imagination. And it's actually quite it's an interesting one. The OED points out that vernacular definitions of imagination focus on the mind as an inner space where thoughts, images and ideas are produced and stored, which then draws on external experiences and imaginatively reworks them. So the everyday understanding of imagination then makes a distinction between the inner imagination and outer experiences. Now, if you look at most academic discussions, particularly around the urban imaginary, I think they do something very similar. Certainly the kind of standard texts that began that now it's a very rich and extensive literature on urban imaginaries, they all kind of assume that imagination is a process which is tethered to human dwellers, human bodies, human thought. It's an aspect of distinctively human interiority. So Andreas Huyssen, in one of the key texts on urban imaginaries, talks about the way the city dwellers imagine their own city with a situated and city-centric consciousness. That's their soja. Tony King talks about what's referred to as the city exists only in our heads. Soja again talks about mental and cognitive mappings. And certainly the urban imaginary of smart cities has been described as a smart mentality. Again, this kind of human interiority as part of what the urban imaginary might be, distinct from what is out there in the world, buildings or data. So this then allows a particular connotation of the word imaginary to emerge, namely that the inner imaginary doesn't correspond adequately to the outside world. Imagination, notes the OED, more than once might include a fanciful project, which can be a quality of genius, it says, but it can also be deluded, or indeed both, which I thought was quite funny. I don't get any jokes from the OED, but that was quite a nice ambivalence. So the critique of the smart city hype as fantasy seems to depend precisely on such a notion of the imagination. The imagination of the corporate smart city marketeer is understood as far too little engaged with the realities of the external world. And although, of course, the production of glossy brochures and glittering websites and dazzling Twitter feeds is in fact a highly materialised practice which depends on a very elaborate, globalised division of labour, nonetheless it's seen as not really kind of the world. Similarly, it's too interior, too distant, and it doesn't produce talk, text or images that sufficiently engage with the real. Shannon Mattern has discussed another implication of this critical move. So rather like the response of a lot of A&T scholarship to the emergence of the smart city, Mattern points out that much arts-based criticism of digital urbanism has turned to various forms of what purport to be description rather than imagination in order to challenge the corporate excesses of these runaway imagined. So if there's too much crazy dreaming going on, well, the one response is to get real and go descriptive. So here's one project by Timo Arnold that visualises the strength of a Wi-Fi signal through an urban space. And there was another exhibition, I mean, there are many of them, one in London in November by Tactical Tech, which is a Berlin-based critical digital arts practice, which was all about simply showing you what smart was, to the extent that many of the exhibits were simply adverts for smart apps being screened. Because somehow, while smart is also invisible and we need imagination to see it, it kind of also apparently is exposing itself. It kind of gives itself away, if you like, if only we could look at it properly. So if humans have both too much and too little imagination then, imagination is clearly this kind of problem thing. It's clear that in many definitions of smart and justifications of smart city, one of its valuable qualities apparently is that it entirely lacks any kind of imagination. So one of the sort of founding manifestos of big data and its usefulness was the notorious editorial in Wired magazine in 2008, which argued precisely that with big data and machine learning, AI, there was no need for any kind of human intervention. Big data could simply be analysed by the machines, and the machines would then fix the problems for us. And indeed, if you go on through the critical literature, while the smart city is occasionally understood as a body, so we have arguments about data being its lifeblood, about the boundaries of the body being the boundaries of its technical models that it depends on, about data being its lifeblood. I mean, interestingly, there are lots of corporealised imagery going on about smart. It's always insisted that smart lacks imagination, even if you think of it as embodied. It's a Frankenstein, to quote the title of a recent paper in Society in Space. It's a patched together body parts that have no consciousness, and this seems to be something that has to be insisted on. And then, of course, many of you know the work of Armin and Thrift, who have been arguing for some time now that smart and digitally saturated urban environments are affective, which is another way in which human imagination, reinvention, thought is kind of bypassed by the affect, this time, of these data-driven urban spaces. So what to do then in the face of this? And at this point I'm quite glad I probably only have about a minute left, because I think it's quite a challenging question to think about. If the act of imagining is being framed in these ways as kind of basically a problem in relation to smart, how then do we respond? And I think one way not to respond is simply to say, well, we need more imagination. I think we need to think about diversifying and complexifying our understanding of what the imagination might be. So I think for a start, we certainly need to think about the imaginary as always technically mediated. And we have plenty of conceptual tools to do that. The imagination is not something that's distinctively human. It's not something that just goes on up here. It's something that always needs tools and technologies to be articulated, to be produced, to be shared, to be distributed, to be archived, to be destroyed. It's profoundly material. And it needs to be thought in that kind of context, to be materialised. And secondly, I think we could think about who's imagining and diverse kinds of imagining that might happen. So smart is a term that was patented by IBM years ago. It's always struck me as smart is a kind of very American term for thinking about what is intelligent. Iona Datta has a great paper out right now talking about smart instead from the way that smart city policymakers in India also talk about smart. She talks about the chatur citizen, not the smart citizen, but the chatur citizen, I hope I'm pronouncing it properly, who's somebody who's kind of streetwise, canny, networked, can survive. I guess this perhaps does make a connection back to different sorts of intelligence that's not simply about being the fastest, the most efficient, the most rational, the most machine-driven. And that's maybe another way in which we can multiply and contextualise and situate diverse forms of imagination, rather than being boxed into this discourse that imagination is a problem that we somehow need to avoid. Thank you.